On the 1st of June 1879, Louis-Napoleon Bonaparte, the 23-year-old great-nephew of the mighty Napoleon Bonaparte, was killed by the Zulus in South Africa. But what was the heir to France's greatest military general doing fighting the Zulus in a British colonial war in southern Africa? This is the story of the death of the Prince Imperial Louis-Napoleon Bonaparte, and with it the dreams of the Napoleonic revival in France. Now, I don't want to get into the complexities of 19th century French politics, but here is a real whistle-stop tour to put it into context. After the great Napoleon Bonaparte's defeat at the Battle of Waterloo in 1815, he was exiled to the British island of St Helena in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, where he died. The old royal family, a pre-French Revolution royal family, were therefore restored in France to the throne. But in 1848, they were once more ousted in a revolution, and yet another republic was declared, one of whose leading members was the nephew of Napoleon Bonaparte. And 4 years later, in 1852, this particular Bonaparte enacted a coup and declared himself Emperor Napoleon III. Are you with me so far? Right, well, 4 years later on the 16th of March 1856, his wife, the Empress Eugenie, gave birth to a son, Louis Napoleon, the Prince Imperial. The young prince was baptised in Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris, with the Pope, Pius IX, acting as his godfather. But as a Bonaparte, he was brought up very much in the shadow of the great man himself. And France's greatness and the Bonaparte's greatness was all about their martial success. In 1879, the Franco-Prussian War broke out and the 14-year-old joined his father at the front. The war was a complete disaster for France and for the young Louis Napoleon. The once glorious French army was defeated and his father, the emperor, actually captured by the Prussians. In Paris, the Bonaparte Empire was overthrown by another revolution and yet another republic was declared. Louis Napoleon and his mother had to flee France and found refuge, of all places, in England. And shortly afterwards his father would join them in exile. The exiled imperial family took up residence at Camden Place in Chislehurst, Kent, which is actually now the home of Chislehurst Golf Club. The listless teenage prince was at a loss. No throne to inherit, no martial glory to emulate his great uncle. It was 2 years later, in 1872, that upon the advice of Queen Victoria's cousin and Commander-in-Chief of the British Army, the Duke of Cambridge, he enlisted at the Royal Military Academy in Woolwich, the training school for engineer and artillery officers. Despite not being a natural English speaker, the Prince Imperial excelled. He came 7th, he passed out 7th of the 34 candidates in his year, and he obtained first prize in both fencing and horse riding. As one of the top 10 cadets, he was offered a place automatically as an officer in the Royal Engineers, which was seen as more superior to the artillery. But instead, he opted for the Royal Artillery, a nod to the artillery background of Napoleon Bonaparte himself. But the appointment was honorary. And anyway, things had taken a dramatic turn in the Prince Imperial's life. Because in 1873, while he was still at Woolwich, his father had died. The Prince Imperial was now the leader of the exiled House of Bonaparte, and the hope of all those who still longed for a Bonaparte restoration in France. There was no way the leader of the French government in waiting could serve in the British armed forces. His credibility back in France would be absolutely ruined. As it was, the Republican press derided the 17-year-old pretender. They called him Napoleon III.5, and also the Imperial Baby. The 1870s became a tiresome decade for Louis Napoleon, head of an exiled royal family and not able to do the only thing he loved and excelled at, soldiering. And then in 1879, an exciting opportunity arose. Way off down in South Africa, the Anglo-Zulu War broke out. The war went disastrously wrong for the British when the Zulus achieved a stunning victory at the Battle of Isandlwana. The British force of over 1,000 men were wiped out. A new invasion force was needed to finish off the job and restore Britain, not to mention Lord Chelmsford's, honour. Louis Napoleon watched as his former classmates at Woolwich travelled to Africa with their regiments. Here was an opportunity for the Prince Imperial to burnish his CV as the future Emperor of France, without ruffling any diplomatic feathers, by fighting for Britain in a European war which could put him at odds with either France or France's allies. British Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli was horrified. Having just suffered the worst defeat a British army was to ever suffer at the hands of a black African army, there was no way he was going to have the Bonaparte heir being killed by the Zulus on his watch. And he point blank refused Louis Napoleon's request. In the end, after shameless lobbying both from his mother, the Empress Eugenie, and Queen Victoria herself, Disraeli relented. Louis Napoleon could go to South Africa, but it was made very clear by Disraeli and the Duke of Cambridge that he was not serving in the British Army. He was going, according to Duke of Cambridge, on his own account. And whilst he would wear the underdress of an officer from the Royal Artillery, he would wear no insignia of rank. In other words, he was attending this war as an observer. The Prince Imperial of France arrived in South Africa at the end of March 1879, and crowds came out in both Cape Town and in Durban to greet him. In fact, whilst he was in Durban, he purchased a new horse, a grey, by the name of Percy. The previous owner of Percy warned that Percy could be skittish, but that didn't really concern an accomplished horseman like the Prince, who had indeed topped his class at riding at the Royal Military Academy in Woolwich. For Lord Chelmsford trying to organise a new invasion just 2 months after the disaster at Isandlwana, the high-profile observer was really something he could do without. To keep the Prince occupied and also safe, he finally decided to assign him to his acting Quartermaster General, Lieutenant Colonel Richard Harrison. Harrison's role was to supply Chelmsford's new invasion army as it's made its way into Zululand. So chances of Napoleon actually being in the front line for any action was almost zero. Actually, Harrison welcomed this new addition to his team because he only had 2 officers on his team at that minute. Major Francis Grenfell, who incidentally appears in my video about the Battle of Omdurman, and Lieutenant Carey. 32-year-old Carey was 9 years older than the Prince. His family had originally come from the Channel Islands, and therefore he was educated in Caen in France and spoke fluent French. He joined the army back in 1864 and had actually been mentioned in dispatches whilst serving with the 3rd West India Regiment in British Honduras, Central America, and had been promoted to the rank of lieutenant shortly afterwards. The French-speaking Carey struck up an instant friendship with the young Prince Imperial. Despite having been given a relatively safe role in the quartermaster's team, the young 23-year-old Bonaparte was desperate to see some action and build his martial credentials. Several times during the month of May he had accompanied patrols scouting into Zululand, and on more than one occasion had actually charged by himself, waving the sword his great-uncle had carried at the Battle of Austerlitz, after solitary Zulus who were seen on the skyline. His rather rash behaviour dismayed some of the senior officers around him, not least Sir Redvers Buller, and Chelmsford told Harrison to try and keep the young Prince Imperial on a tighter leash. On the 31st of May, the Prince Imperial entered Harrison's tent and asked for permission to go out on patrol to complete some landscape sketches that he had previously made. Now, remember that in those days, without cameras, these landscape sketches were actually a really important component in military planning. Harrison considered the request. Despite being told to keep the Prince Imperial sort of out of harm's way, the area in front of them was considered by the British, including Chelmsford himself, free of Zulus. Men of military age in the Zululand had gone to a general summons at the Zulu capital of Ulundi, and civilians had fled their kraals or sort of farm homesteads ahead of the advancing British. The area was also being crisscrossed by loads of mounted patrols, and where the Prince Imperial wanted to go was less than 10 miles from the main British camp. With all that in mind, Harrison agreed. However, the Prince was to take an escort of 6 men from New Zealander Lieutenant Bettington's irregular cavalry, and also a half a dozen mounted Basosos from the Edendale contingent of the Natal Native Horse. The following morning, the 6 troopers from Lieutenant Bettington's horse unit presented themselves to Harrison. Harrison was somewhat surprised to find that Lieutenant Bettington himself had been called out onto another patrol, and the most senior man that he'd sent in his troop was just a corporal. At that moment, Lieutenant Carey entered and requested to accompany the Prince's patrol. And as the patrol was lacking an officer, Harrison agreed. By 9 AM, with no sign of the Edentail contingent, the Prince decided to set out with his half of his escort. The patrol consisted of the Prince, Lieutenant Carey, a Zulu guide, and 6 of Bettington's men, led by Corporal Grubb, including a French-speaking Channel Islander by the name of Letok. At around 12:30, Louis-Napoleon spied a deserted kraal in a valley and decided to take a closer look. They arrived down at the kraal at about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. There were no signs of life, although the Zulu guide reported that some of the ash outside one of the huts was still warm. Thatch was taken off some of the roofs to make a small fire, and soon coffee was on the go. The men dismounted and let their horses wander off to graze, and then they settled down to smoke and chat. Carey and the Prince Imperial discussed the campaigns of his great uncle. Unbeknownst to the small patrol, their progress had been monitored by a Zulu patrol on a neighbouring hillside. Slowly, silently, they descended towards the kraal. The kraal was surrounded on 3 sides by grass and maize that had grown to a height of about 6 feet. To the north was a dongara, a dried riverbed. Despite this lack of visibility, the British had not posted a patrol or a lookout, and it was into this dense cover of thick grass and maize that the Zulus slipped. After about half an hour, Carey suggested that they move on, but the Prince said they could rest for another 10 minutes. The Zulu guide now approached and said he was sure he'd just seen a Zulu in the long grass. The Prince Imperial ordered the men to gather in the horses, which took about 10 minutes because they'd wandered off grazing. And when they were all gathered together, he shouted the order, "Prepare to mount!" And the men placed their left foot in the stirrup and grasped their reins and their saddles of their horses. As the command "Mount!" was shouted, a volley of shots rang out from the thick grass, and suddenly anything up to 40 Zulus appeared. The noise of the rifles and the war cries from the Zulus panicked the horses who bolted, and quite frankly any semblance of discipline in that little patrol broke down. It was every man for himself. Trooper Rogers was unseated and was last seen running through the kraal with fleet-footed Zulus in hot pursuit. Trooper Abel was hit in the back by a bullet and fell to the ground dead. Percy, the Prince's horse, bolted, and Louis-Napoleon could not pull himself up into the saddle. He hung desperately onto the leather gun holster hanging off the saddle as Percy careered nearly 100 yards up the dried riverbed. Suddenly, the strap holding that holster gave way, and Louis-Napoleon slipped and was trampled by Percy, who then raced off into the distance. Utterly alone, the Prince Imperial turned to face his pursuers. He reached for his great-grandfather's Austerlitz sword, but found that it was no longer in its scabbard. Instead, he drew his revolver in his left hand, and as the Zulus closed in, he fired 2 shots. They were the only shots anyone in that patrol fired that afternoon. 7 Zulus surrounded him, and one warrior by the name of Zamanga thrust his assegai into the Prince's left shoulder. Grabbing the assegai in his own right hand, the Prince Imperial pulled it out and started to use it to defend himself, but his left arm was too weak now to be able to raise his revolver. According to the Zulus' survivors, he fought like a lion. Eventually, exhausted and losing blood, he sank into a seated position. And in a short stabbing frenzy, it was all over. The last great hope of a Bonaparte revival in France lay dead and deserted in a dried-up riverbed in Zululand. Meanwhile, Carey had gathered the other 4 survivors and rode for the main camp to deliver the bad news to Chelmsford. And the next morning, Chelmsford ordered a force of over 1,000 cavalry to head out to search for the body. A French journalist from the Figaro newspaper lamented that in life the Prince had left with an escort of just 7 men, but in death he'd have an escort of 1,000. Arriving at the kraal, the cavalry found the mutilated bodies of troopers Abel, Rogers and the Zulu guide. And then a shout went up. Someone had found the prince. Louis-Napoleon was naked, save for a gold chain and a medal of the Virgin Mary around his neck. He had not been mutilated. Zulu oral history says that the warriors thought that the Virgin medallion was actually some form of magic and didn't really want to touch his body. Well, be that as it may, his body carried 17 wounds, 2 of which would have been fatal. An assegai thrust above his heart and another one through his eye into his brain. In his right hand, he still clutched a handful of Zulu hair. The body was hastily embalmed and then, somewhat ironically for Prince Imperial of France and descendant of Napoleon Bonaparte, it was wrapped in a Union flag. In great solemnity, his body was taken to Durban and placed on a Royal Naval vessel back to Britain. It took over 2 weeks for the news of the death to reach England. The country was stunned. The death of the Prince Imperial received more press coverage than the disaster at Isandlwana. Across the English Channel, France was in uproar. Not only the Bonapartist supporters, but all Frenchmen. In life, Louis-Napoleon was a danger to the French Republic. In death, he was no longer a threat, but a martyr for France. Conspiracy theories abounded that the British and even Queen Victoria herself had deliberately had the heir to the great Napoleon killed by the Zulus. British travellers had to actually flee to Channel ports, and English businesses, British businesses in France shuttered their windows against potential vandalism. Feelings ran that high. On the 11th of July 1879, nearly 3 weeks after the news had reached England, the Prince's coffin was brought ashore at Woolwich. A vast crowd of 40,000 filled the streets of Chislehurst in Kent for his funeral procession, which was led by Queen Victoria herself. In the meantime, Lieutenant Carey had faced a court-martial on the charge of misbehaviour before the enemy. Carey argued that he had never been in command. It was the Prince's patrol, the Prince had requested it. It was the Prince who'd refused to wait for the Edendale escort. It was the Prince who chose to rest at the kraal. And it was the Prince who'd failed to post a lookout. Basically, he, Lieutenant Carey, well, he was just along for the ride and had rallied the survivors, actually, when they'd all ridden out of the donga. The prosecution countered that the Prince Imperial held no rank. He was an observer. And that even if he had held a rank, Carey had been an officer longer and therefore was the senior officer on that day. Chelmsford felt he had no choice. Finding Carey guilty, he ordered him to be cashiered out of the army. The British public and press, however, were not so sure. Whilst technically Carey might have been in command, there seems to have been some sort of ambiguity as to whether Harrison had actually given him command. And they also felt that the conviction took no account of the deference which class-ridden Victorians would have given a prince, whether he had military command or not. The Duke of Cambridge overturned the conviction. Carey was readmitted to the army. In fact, he actually received a backdated promotion that had actually been awarded just before the whole debacle. But a once promising career was ruined. Captain Carey died just a few years later, 1883, while serving with the army in India from peritonitis. A year after the Prince Imperial's death, his mother, the Empress Eugenie, made a pilgrimage to the spot where he fell in Zululand. She erected a cross on the very spot where he died, and it's still there to this day. Louis Napoleon's body was moved by the Empress from Chislehurst to St Michael's Roman Catholic Abbey in Farnborough, where it rests alongside her husband, the former Emperor of France. The Empress Eugenie was to be buried with them when she finally died, in 1920. The people of Chislehurst erected a monument on the common to their adopted son, and the road that runs close by is still called Prince Imperial Road. The death of the Prince Imperial did not change the outcome of the Anglo-Zulu War. A week before the coffin had arrived back in London, Lord Chelmsford had gained his revenge for Isandlwana as he decisively defeated the Zulu army at Ulundi. The Zulu king Keshwayo was captured and his kingdom ultimately annexed into the British Empire. The Prince Imperial's death did, however, mark the end of the last serious dynastic hope for a Bonaparte restoration in France. As Disraeli said of the Zulus in the House of Commons, they defeat our generals and they settle the fate of a great European dynasty. And I'll leave you with this poignant thought. As the Prince Imperial desperately clung to Percy as they raced into that dried up riverbed, the Donga, with the Zulus chasing after them, Trooper Latoc, the Channel Islander, the French-speaking Channel Islander, raced past him on his horse and shouted, "Dépêchez-vous, s'il vous plaît, Votre Altesse!" Please hurry up, Your Highness. Isn't it strange that the last friendly words the Prince Imperial heard so far from home were in his native tongue? Well, thanks for watching, and I hope you enjoyed this forgotten story from history. If you did, then please subscribe so you don't miss any future videos. In the meantime, stay well, and I'll see you very soon.